Okay, paper one. We'll start with these couple of secondary topics. There are a lot of history of English literature texts, history of English literature books that are there in the market, and it's not a bad idea to read them. But my idea is that you should be able to read the texts and then deduce what that era was like. Difficult way to approach it, but somehow that's the only way you will get a first-hand understanding of the text. Renaissance, Elizabethan, and Jacobean era. When we start paper one's timelines. So when we'll be doing the entire thing, we should have a very broad understanding of the timelines, not the dates, but at least the years or the centuries. Don't bother too much about when this book came out. A tentative idea is fine because we'll be moving from Renaissance, Elizabethan, Jacobean, neoclassical, romantic, Victorian, then modern, then postmodern. Renaissance starts somewhere 15th century, 1400, about 100, 50 years. Elizabethan and Jacobean are primarily British terms based on the queen and the king. Renaissance itself used to be at least a good 10 marker idea every year. I don't remember in last 4 or 5 years they have asked Renaissance directly. But the understanding of Renaissance will also help you understand Shakespeare and John Donne. So these are the three texts, two texts of Shakespeare and one text of John Donne, where your understanding of Renaissance, Elizabethan, and Jacobean would help. Not so much Jacobean, but Elizabethan and Renaissance. So that's what we'll try to cover in this text. There are some interesting, I'll skip right away to some interesting things that happened in this Renaissance age. By the way, what do you mean by the term Renaissance? You must have read around. What do you think the literal meaning of Renaissance is?
Change, radical change.
Radical change. Okay.
Rebirth. I mean, the humanity over divinity concept was there.
Rebirth.
Early, yeah, earlier the monarchs were considered as divine, and later
Hmm.
on, much humanistic approach was taken that uh, divinity is not the highest thing; it's individuals' passion and different pleasure. The humanist idea, the humanist angle of seeing things.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. More or less on the right track. So what was happening in Europe before Renaissance? Sometimes it's called the Dark Ages. The kings and the kingdoms, they were fighting all the dirty wars, a real bloodbath, the ever-going constant battle for supremacy and sovereign kingdoms, control over sovereign kingdoms all over Europe. We have texts from England, texts from Britain, United Kingdom. United Kingdom was always again embroiled in different wars. There was Scotland in the north, there is England, the south, and the Wales. So Welsh kings, Scottish kings, English kings, and then don't forget the Irish, the island of Ireland. And all these people, they migrated from Europe. So that Anglo-Saxon history, we won't get into. Those who have studied English literature, they would have read Anglo-Saxon history and the background of where they came from. So the key turning point in Renaissance that happened was this family, the Medici family in Italy. They inherited some large sum of money, banks and financial institutions. And in Florence, it started from Florence in Italy. I've been to Florence. They started putting their focus upon arts, music, literature, and the aesthetic sides of things. That was, in the beginning, it was simply a beautification idea for the city. At the same time, there were technological advances happening. This Gutenberg Bible that was published because printing press became a technology. Europe and especially England was very high, very big on the maritime research because they wanted ships to travel to far off lands. So they wanted their ships to forever develop and be an advanced mechanism of traveling, carrying their soldiers and their people to far off lands for colonization and uh, expanding of their empire. That is where when Columbus reaches the North America because of the advancement in the maritime industry. Now the Bible was published and printed for the first time. Hold on to this idea for a minute and its impact on the larger mass. Most of these people that you're looking on the screen, the Medici family, the Bible, Gutenberg Bible happened in Germany, Columbus in Europe, Michelangelo, I think he was Italian, Machiavelli, again Italian, the Peace Pact of Augsburg, first modern atlas, all this happened across Europe. Michelangelo's David, which was, if you look at it, it's just a sculpture, it's just a stone idol. But it marked a significant difference in what Tejasvi said, that from a collective level of consciousness, the focus shifted to individualism or the capacity of an individual human to make an impact. Something that was not the case beforehand. Now, because of the press, and that is an entire completely different topic in itself, that the printing press allowed people to write, allowed people to circulate their voice, something just, it was a huge change, huge change. It completely one of the biggest technical advancement of probably last 500 years. Then artists like Michelangelo, later Da Vinci, musicians like Mozart, they all sustained that potential and promise of an individual human being. Machiavelli's The Prince, it's a political manifesto. It talks about the cruelest selfish interest that any king, or in this case, he talks about the prince trying to usurp the kingdom. The most crucial selfish ideas to sustain an individual. Although it's a political manifesto, people have read it to understand how one can live his own life, an individual life, in an utter self-sustainable model, that you have to first of all look after your own interests or the interest of your kingdom or the interest of the people around you. Then only you can think about the larger society or the larger family or the larger world. Again, the first modern atlas was made possible because of the printing mechanism. And now the atlas told about the vastness of the world. Columbus was recognized as an individual explorer. Obviously, there must have been a team, there must have been a vast crew. Vasco da Gama came to India, to Asia. He didn't do it alone, obviously. But now it was probably, for us, it's a difficult thing, difficult concept to understand, because we are living in an age where individualism has become the norm. Every social media influencer, everyone who wants to be famous, we're talking about personal branding, right? Somebody does something stupid in a bank, for example, but they don't blame the bank, they blame that specific person. So we are living in an age where individuality is probably highly in an octane mode. But we are talking about this time in the 14th and the 15th century where an individual was just a cog in a wheel. It was, if you think about it, it was a very Marxist kind of an idea that you're just a part of a larger structure. King and the kingdoms and the rich and the aristocrats and the and the larger benefactors of the society, they were the only people. Everyone else was just a mass, just a cog in the wheel, just a fighting hand. And then this renaissance, because this family, it all started, I read a lot about them and what all they did and what all they financed. They sponsored so many artists, sponsored so many musicians, sponsored anyone who came with an idea to make their city beautiful. And once they started doing it in Florence, other parts of Italy all also picked up. Other families, other rich patrons and benefactors, they also started doing that. Before that, it was only a king's or a queen's prerogative that they were the only people who would, make any changes in the city. Now there are families, there are the groups, the rich groups, and it once they allowed these artisans, authors, even explorers, kind of a startup euphoria, something that's happening in India at the moment. The people have ideas, and now there are investors and VCs who are willing to back those ideas. And now those people who are going out and becoming founders, they, if they end up doing something interesting and significant, they become famous, right? Something like that was happening. And it's difficult for us to understand because we're living in that age, and for us, we take it for granted. Nothing new. What's new in that? Do a little write up. It was a cultural, scholarly, socio-political movement which stressed the rediscovery and application of texts and thought from classical antiquity. It brought new discoveries in science, new art forms in writing, painting, and sculpture, and state funded explorations of distant lands. Much of this was driven by humanism, a philosophy that emphasized the ability for humans to act rather than simply rely on the will of God. Established religious communities experienced both philosophical and bloody battles, leading, among other things, to the Reformation and the end of Catholic rule in England. Down the line, it happened. Now, the interesting thing how Renaissance is interesting for us for UPSC syllabus. There are tons and tons and tons of books you can read about it, but we don't need to read tons of books on the topic. What matters is if you look at last 20 years questions and if you can find any question that talks about Renaissance, what they're trying to find out is the texts that we have in the syllabus, The Tempest, King Lear, and John Donne's poetry. What impact of Renaissance do you see on these texts? They've asked this question that discuss the impact of Renaissance on Shakespeare. They've also, UPSC has also asked, discuss the impact of Renaissance on British literature. So it's a little more wider. But when they're saying British literature, we only have three texts and two authors, and they're both British. So they're asking you to include all three. They can be very specific and they can ask you impact of Renaissance on John Donne or The Tempest or King Lear, or they can ask you how is King Lear product of Renaissance, or how is Prospero or the ideas of Prospero, colonial ideas of Prospero are an impact of Renaissance. So do you see what I'm trying to tell you? That if you understand the age, UPSC wants to understand how much are you able to contextualize that idea, understanding of that age from the text. Because they're not going to ask you for a definition of Renaissance history or the events that shaped Renaissance. They will always ask you to come back and connect it with the text. So, yes, for understanding, you have to read the sociopolitics, you have to read the history of Renaissance, you have to read the key events just to make an understanding. And then when you come to the text, you have to critically think which elements are the elements of Renaissance. Like the primary element that this writer talks about is the idea of humanism, which kind of took away the focus from the will of God to the possibility of humans, which was a major paradigm shift. And this idea will keep shaping as the science will improve. Artists like Da Vinci. Now, the interesting part is a lot of scientists of this age, including Galileo, Da Vinci, even Michelangelo, who was primarily a sculptor, most of these people, they were very scholarly scientists as well, which is probably not the right term to use technically, but they were very empirical minded. They were not just aesthetics driven artists. They were very logical and rational, right? Uh, what's that Da Vinci's figure of that man? Which, what's the word for that man? Any of you know that? That gives a dimension of the perfect human body. Vitruvius man, I think. Let me check. Da Vinci gave that. And within a circle, every NCRT book has that on the first page. So they were people with really curious, observational, and of course artistic mindset. Gradually, as the faculty of science, as a faculty, as a scholarship will develop, we'll see more and more people questioning the will of God. And eventually in England, the Catholic Church will be, the power of Catholic Church will be completely demolished and transferred to the monarch, Queen Victoria. And later on in the modern society, in paper two, when we'll read this complete breakdown and disillusionment of religion starts happening. So this will take 400 years. But the start of that movement from the will of God to the possibility of human beings to be able to do things. We'll read in Prospero, in the Tempest, in when we'll do the Shakespeare's play, that Prospero is a king who stays in isolation for 12 years on an island and harbors and develops so much of power to be able to control nature. Now, that is a clear Renaissance idea that he overcomes the will of God, because nature is the will of God. How can you control nature? You're controlling God. So, Prospero is that character that becomes so powerful that he can control nature. So, that commentary on this idea, and Shakespeare, because he's a brilliant writer, so he's critically playing with that idea. Eventually, what happens, we'll read in the text, but this is very much visible in Shakespeare. This is very much visible in the poetry of John Donne, where we'll see that John Donne is moving away from this religious, traditional, conservative idea of God and religion to a bit more, and people called him obscene for his time, because he said love is God. Whether it's erotic love, if you want to call it erotic, or just a simple connection between a man and a woman, that is as good as praying. Radical idea for the time, right? So we see signs of Renaissance. That is the impact of Renaissance, because they grew up in that time. So we have to always think about how that age, Renaissance, for example, Elizabethan, how that age impacts that society, that era, and how can we deduce that in the texts. So if I'm saying, okay, tell me about Renaissance from the reading of Shakespeare, So when you read Shakespeare and you know what Renaissance is, you should be able to deduce that. That is what UPSC is after. Not those long definitions. If you'll read that history of English literature text, you'll just page after page after page after page after stuff that is not relevant to what we're doing. It's a good reading. You can do it once, but it's just too much, right? Elizabethan, UPSC never asks, will never ask you, they give us the dates of Elizabethan, Jacobean, or Renaissance, or Neoclassical. These dates are for our references only, to place the timeline. Body of work written during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, 1558-1603. The most splendid age in the history of English literature. We'll understand why, because some of the greatest English writers, Sir Philip Sidney, Edmund Spenser, Hooker, Marlowe, Shakespeare, they flourished in the Elizabethan era. Poetry flourished. Now there is a reason for that, because this is happening soon after Renaissance. So what started to flower in Europe during Renaissance, as I talked about the flourishing of art, literature, poetry, aesthetics, people like Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Galileo later on. That impact started because all this was coming to England. And a lot of these art forms, a lot of this poetry, for example, the sonnet form that Shakespeare made so famous in England, came from Europe, right? A lot of these poetry styles, the Spenserian stanza, dramatic blank verse, all this was coming from authors and poets who practiced this, mastered this, and grew this during the Renaissance. So Elizabethan era, one, because it was a stable era, about 40 years, 43 years of Queen Elizabeth I. So it was a stable time. And she really patroned all these authors and artists well. Shakespeare's global theatre was completely funded and built by Queen Elizabeth. And it burned down, it was built again. So she was a good patron. She was a good, what do you call, what's that word, specific word, for arts. So that's why all these authors flourished in the Elizabethan era. It was a good time. Shakespeare, we can read as much as about Shakespeare, but we'll read more when we'll be doing the texts and understand Shakespeare from his works. And but so he was doing well during the time of Elizabeth I. One of the greatest thing that Elizabeth did was she set up all these open air theaters, and she made these theaters mainstream. Before that, theaters were only available for the rich. Theaters were not for the common people. She commercialized those theaters, and obviously Shakespeare, his theater company, and other people like him, they voraciously wrote a lot of plays. People performed. So there was a supply and there was a demand, and theater, the playwright art form, became very, very famous. Initially, obviously, all these plays and all these things, all, even poetry, even whatever was written, it was written as a propaganda tool for the queen. This is normally, that's what happens. But Shakespeare was so smart that even though he wrote about so many monarchs, so many kings, right? He wrote about Henry, he wrote about Richard, he wrote about so many, King Lear, but he always found a way, a literary way, to drop a message. That is why even in 2025, when you read a Shakespearean play, it is still relevant. It is universal. It is universally beyond time. So it was not something that was written in 1623. It was written for that time because people enjoyed it at that time and these plays were successful. So obviously, people at that time enjoyed it. Even today, if you can just change the characters and make them contemporary, this play would work. Vishal Bhardwaj made films on Hamlet, Othello, right? Those same characters. So that is the beauty of Shakespeare. Jacobean came. There was a brief period of reign of James the First, and he was successor to Queen Elizabeth the First. It was not as good in terms of literature as the Elizabethan's time. There was obviously political turmoil. It is said that Shakespeare wrote some of the greatest tragedies in the Jacobean time. So he wrote tragedies later, and it is ascribed that they were written during the Jacobean era. We don't have to go through why this happened and all that. I don't even know why this is relevant to us, but this is something that happened. Uh, we have the Tempest that we ascribe to Jacobean era, and King Lear to Elizabethan. So King Lear was probably written in the Elizabethan, performed during that time, and Tempest was done during Jacobean era. One of the interesting things that happened in this era was the publishing of King James Bible. If you're aware about any history about Bible, uh, this was the first printed, published, widely accepted Bible in England, and it was criticized that King James edited as per his understanding and view of the world. A lot of changes were revised and later edited out, but this King James Bible became the standard biblical text for centuries to come. If you've seen the Vinci Code movie, they are talking about the reference in that movie is King James Bible. There is very little difference between these two eras because they almost overlapped, and whatever was the style of writing and style of reading in Elizabethan continued in the Jacobean. It's just a matter of technical dates. But some of the things was that Elizabethan was a break from medieval period, the Dark Ages medieval, and Jacobean was the continuation of Elizabethan. Elizabethan was more stable cultural period, and it was an offshoot of Renaissance. Jacobean was probably sustained by King James himself because he himself understood writing very well. In the Jacobean, anti-Catholicism was taking severe shape. Theatre was flourished and set up in Elizabethan. In the Jacobean, it became a norm. It became a more mainstream thing in the open air. In the Elizabethan, playwrights focused on all classes, but in the Jacobean and for next 50 years, 100 years, they'll focus more on the elite and the refined audience. John Donne we'll talk about when we'll do John Donne. John Donne is one of the most interesting uh, poets you will read in the entire syllabus. We'll take up some questions after 5-7 minutes. So the interesting part about Renaissance and Jacobean and Elizabethan is read a bit around what we've talked about. The difficult part in doing this English literature syllabus is how much to read on every topic. For example, Renaissance, you can read books after books. Any history of English literature text will give you hundreds of authors active in Renaissance. We don't need to even remember the names of those 100 authors. We just need to remember two names, William Shakespeare and John Donne. So that is the answer to the question, how much to read. Entire syllabus, this will be your challenge when you'll be reading the socio-political background or the background of any era or age. How much to read? You'll go on the internet and there'll be so much. We'll have to focus simply on the texts in the syllabus. The Tempest, King Lear, and the poetry of John Donne. That's it. Any question they'll ask, you'll have to use these texts. Even if they ask you to write a short note on Renaissance, let's say 10 marker, it used to happen. Short note on Renaissance. They haven't asked you, they haven't categorically asked you to include any of the texts. But your answer will be incomplete if you do not bring in the texts. If you do not use the text to discuss Renaissance or Elizabethan or Jacobean. It is highly unlikely, it has never happened that they'll ask you to compare Elizabethan or Jacobean or Elizabethan or Renaissance. They don't, it becomes very technical, very literary technical. All they want you to understand is, can you understand the socio-politics of Queen Elizabeth I, her impact, her contribution to literature, specifically because this is a literature paper. We are really not bothered about cultural flourishing. So literature, maybe theater, and specifically on the texts. So do you see how we are narrowing down, right? From culture to literature to Shakespeare and John Donne to texts. So that is how your answer has to be built. You start wide. This is for short notes. This is for topics that are just open wide topics. Last 3 years, UPSC has stopped doing it because students were just going all over the place. I'm sure when they asked you a question about Renaissance or Victorian society, students just vomited the entire whatever they read and all the notes that they did without mentioning the text even once. So now they are very specific. Even the short notes are coming in the form of specific questions. This doesn't used to happen earlier. So they're very specific. They'll ask you very specific idea, which is easier and it makes your job a lot easier, but still always focus on the text. Renaissance, Elizabethan and Jacobean. A logical transformation happens towards neoclassical, because as we read in one of the slides, that there was a fervor for classical texts, classical Greek and Latin texts. People started to read those texts, to revive those texts. Now with printing press, those texts become more available and accessible. So those classical ideas will start to shape European life. And as we move to neoclassical age towards Alexander Pope, we will see that they become so obsessed about the classical text that they will be just blindly following and quoting and living their life, almost like a pseudo classical fan. We'll see that in The Rape of the Lock, Alexander Pope's poem. That poem is an entire satire over this blind following of the classical antiquity. These classical texts will continue to influence authors all the way when we'll be doing paper 2 in modernism. T.S. Eliot, big fan of the classical text. W.B. Yeats, Auden, they refer and they quote classical texts and classical references from Aristotle, Plato, from Greek literature, Odysseus, Homer's texts. They refer very freely. So this is where it started to happen with printing press. It started to flourish and became a norm. Shakespeare used a lot of not a lot of classical ideas. He used a lot of historical ideas from last 1000 years. King Lear was supposed to be a king who was an actual person not too far ago. But he remodified, remixed, and recreated a character based on a real character. So that gave him some credibility. We'll take up some of the questions in the next section. I'm closing this section now, and we can join in this on the same link, I guess.